So let's now build an entire animation with JavaScript instead of CSS. And I will do that for this paragraph. Therefore, I will actually remove all those para- classes. I will simply delete them here so that we no longer use those CSS classes to control how this is being animated. Instead, I now want to use JavaScript for that. And that is something which is also supported by the transition component. Now, typically, you will most often use CSS, but using JavaScript instead can be useful if you, for example, want to use a third-party JavaScript-based animation library like GreenSock. GreenSock has nothing to do with Vue, but it is a powerful JavaScript library for orchestrating and building animations, complex animations with JavaScript. And that then would be a use case where you might want to build your entire transition with JavaScript because you might want to leverage a library like this. But even without such a library, you can use JavaScript to animate this paragraph here, for example. And that's exactly what we'll do now. For that, we already added all those hooks, and you will need those hooks here. You will need them because building an animation with JavaScript requires those hooks here. Because to some extent, they will still be called even if you have no CSS code, even if you have no CSS animation. If I reload here, for example, and keep in mind that I removed the CSS classes which were added previously, we still see before enter, enter, and after enter being called. We have no actual transition, everything is instant, but those hooks are still called. So those events on the transition component are always emitted when the wrapped element is added or removed to the DOM. But without any CSS code that controls the animation, they just execute instantly after each other, because of course there is nothing to wait for. But that's something we can change with JavaScript now. For that, in before enter, we could set up our initial animation state. For example, here we could reach out to this element, which is the element on which we want to perform the animation, and we could set a style here. We could set the style property here and give it an opacity of 0. This is a way of programmatically setting the opacity of this element to 0 initially. This is vanilla JavaScript, which we also can use here in Vue. Now that's my initial style. In enter, I now want to change this to 1, but not instantly, but over a certain duration. And that's something we can build by calling setInterval here. SetInterval is a built-in JavaScript function which allows us to execute code every few milliseconds. The second argument here is the amount of milliseconds we want to wait until the next code execution, and here we could use 20. And the first argument is a function which will now be executed every 20 milliseconds. And here we could gradually change the opacity. We can do this by using our element and setting its opacity, but now not to a hard-coded value, but to a dynamically derived value. And to dynamically derive a value based on the number of intervals we already completed, or the number of function executions we already completed, we can keep track of the current round, you could say. Add a little helper variable named round here, start at 1, and set the opacity equal to round times .1, for example. So in round 1, we set it to 10% opacity. In the next round, we'll set it to 20%. Now we just need to increment the round every time interval is called, every time this function is called by setInterval. And we need an exit condition and check if round is greater than 10, at which point we already reached 100% opacity. And if that's the case, I want to call clear interval and clear this interval. We can do this by storing the interval, or a unique ID pointing at that interval, you could say, in a constant. and passing this to clear interval. So now the interval will be cleared, will be stopped if we exceeded 10 rounds. And now we should animate this over time. But with that alone, we'll have a small problem. It will work, I will say that. If I reload, we can see that the paragraph fades in, right? That is something you can see. And if it's too fast, you can slow it down by only increasing this by 1%, let's say, and waiting for 100 rounds. Now we'll wait 2 seconds in the end until this is fully visible. So if we save that and reload, now this fades in slowly here. But you'll notice a problem here on the right. If I reload, clear the console and click toggle paragraph, it fades in over 2 seconds, but after enter is actually called right at the start. Watch again. I click toggle paragraph and after enter is called right away. This might or might not matter to you. Maybe it does not matter to you. Maybe you don't care about this. But actually the order is wrong, as you can tell. It's called too early. And in some cases this might matter. And this is not a bug, but instead Vue has no chance of knowing when it should call after enter. To us it's obvious. I mean, we're done with enter once we in the end make it into this if condition. But that's something Vue doesn't really understand. That's way too logical. It doesn't parse and try to understand our code and our reasons behind writing that code. Instead, we have to tell Vue when we're done here. And for that, enter actually receives a second argument automatically. And that's a done function, which you can call whenever you want to signal to Vue that you are done in this hook. You don't need to call it if you're having CSS-based animations, because then Vue is able to read the duration in the CSS code. But if you're not using CSS, if you have your own logic and the duration is simply just made up by incrementing round and checking this condition and having a certain interval time here, then you need to call done explicitly to let Vue know when you're done. So here after clear interval, we call done. We call this done argument as a function to let Vue know when we're done. If I reload here, now we can toggle the paragraph and you see after enter is now really only called at a later point of time once we are indeed done. And this is now how you can control animations with JavaScript. And of course, we're not limited to controlling the enter animation with JavaScript. We can also write something similar for leaving. And definitely feel free to write the equivalent for this enter animation for the leave case. So basically the opposite, going from 1 to 0. Here is a quick pause for you to pause the video and try this on your own, and thereafter we'll do it together. So, were you successful? Let's try it together now. And for that here, in leave, I will basically use the same logic as I had here for entering. I'll copy this entire code and bring it over to leave, but I'll do the opposite here. I will basically set my opacity to 1 minus this calculation so that we start at 1 and I reduce it. And thereafter we can leave the rest of the code as it is. However, in before leave, I of course also want to set the initial opacity to 1, though that is a bit redundant because that is our end state and our initial state of the rendered and attached element anyways. Nonetheless, we can set it here to be very clear about the fact that this is our starting state for the leave animation. And of course, we also need to accept this done argument here in the leave method so that we can call it here when we are done. Now we can also, of course, work with different timings here, a different amount of rounds if we wanted to, but I'll leave everything as it is. And with that, if I reload, I can toggle a paragraph to animate it in, and then I can also animate it out. And that is how you can control animations with JavaScript. Now, by the way, if this is animating in, and I then click toggle paragraph, again, this automatically cancels and reverses it. However, you also see it flickers a little bit. And it's flickering because in the end, it's playing two animations at the same time. If we cancel the first animation, that effectively just means that the leave animation starts before the entering animation finished, or the other way around. So then both animations are playing at the same time, resulting in that flickering which you saw here. And that's also something we can prevent. Because there is another useful event which is emitted by the transition component. And that is the enter dash cancelled event and the leave cancelled event. And here we can execute methods which are called whenever the animation is cancelled. And by the way, those events are always emitted when it's cancelled, no matter if you're writing your logic with JavaScript, as we're doing it here, or if you would be using CSS as we did before. Whenever one transition isn't finished, when you start a new transition, the respective cancelled event will be emitted. So here we can have an enter cancelled method and a leave cancelled method that should be called. Now let's add those two methods therefore. Enter cancelled and leave cancelled. And of course here we can now also log something to the console. We also get the element here and we could change it. But I want to do one important thing here. If the enter animation gets cancelled, I want to cancel my enter interval here, this interval, immediately before it completes. So that it's not just cleared if the rounds reach 100, but that I also clear it if enter cancelled is triggered. So that the enter animation is immediately cancelled when the leave animation starts. And I want to do the same in leave cancelled. The problem is that we store our interval in constants which are part of the enter and the leave methods. So these constants are only available inside of these methods and not available inside of enter and leave cancelled. But the solution is simple. These are regular methods in the methods property, right? So in the end, we can just use data property to store those intervals. And we can have our enter interval here, which initially is null, and our leave interval, which initially is null. And now we store the interval we create here in the enter method in this enter interval, and we clear this enter interval here, and we do the same in the leave method. There we store the interval in this leave interval, and we cancel this leave interval. We'll face a little problem here, because here we're accessing this leave interval and this enter interval inside of a nested function, and in there the this keyword will unfortunately not refer to the same thing, to the view app object, as it does outside of this nested function. The workaround is simple. We use an arrow function. There the this keyword is not overwritten and will therefore keep its context. So make sure that in both set interval calls you use an arrow function. And with that we can now use leave and enter interval, those new data properties, also in the cancelled methods. And we can call clear interval on this enter interval, and in leave cancelled, clear interval on this leave interval. And if we save this, yeah, my setup complains that I'm never using the L property. Well, therefore, for completeness sake, I will log it here. Alternatively, you omit it if you don't need it. But I will just leave it here so that it is clear that we would be getting it. Log it here, save it, everything saves now. And now if we click toggle paragraph and click again, now we have no flickering, because now we're canceling this, we're clearing the interval, and we're going back to removing this therefore. So this is now enter and leave cancelled. that these events exist and what you can do with them.